office. It is the Regional English Language Office. We are coming from the United States Embassy in Lima, Peru. RELO is Regional English Language Office. Again, it has to do with all things related to English language education, particularly in supporting teachers. So my name is Maggie Steingraber. I'm an English language fellow who is here working with the RELO office. With the software that we're using, I'm sure you got an email if you've joined us today. It is either from Citrix or GoToWebinar for your confirmation. It's the webinar it's the software that we use for the webinar. We want it to be as engaging for you as possible. So before we begin with the presentation, I just want to walk you through the different tools that we have, and they will come up throughout the webinar so you're aware of how to use them when they come up. First, this is your control panel. As you can see, you are muted, and you will remain muted throughout the webinar. We cannot hear you. We also do not use webcams, just out of consideration for people who are joining us with low connectivity. So we cannot see you or hear you, and you will not be able to see us, but you should be able to hear us. If this control panel bothers you throughout the presentation, you can either collapse it or expand it using this orange arrow. Some of the other things that you're able to do with this are the first one, the chat box. This is just like a chat box that you would see on social media or your Gmail. If you have any questions throughout, you can type in a message and that will go to us. Enter it here where it says questions, and we will be able to see it. We will take questions on the content at the very end of the webinar. There should be about 10 or 15 minutes for you to ask questions to the speaker. But if a question does come up about the content, you can type it in at any time. We will save it for the very end, but you can ask it any time. We'll save it. Also, if you have questions on a technical problem that you're having, if you're having audio problem, visual problem, type it in and we will be able to respond to you immediately to try to help you through it. The next tool we have is hand raising. This is meant to be just like raising your hand in a regular classroom, except with the amount of people we have, if you have a question and you raise your hand, we might not be able to see you. So we use the hand raising just to take quick polls. So if we want to see how many of you have or have not done something, we might ask you to raise your hand. This is what the hand raising tool looks like. It is the little icon with a hand and the up arrow. So just so that we know that you found it, if you found the hand-raising tool on your control panel, can you please raise your hand? Just so that we know that you found it. There we go. Looks like a lot of you found it. All right, great. All right, good. About 20% of you found it. So with that, again, if the presenter, I think a few times will come up, the presenter will ask you to raise your hand. That's what she's talking about. Just click on that button and we'll be able to have you counted for. The next tool we have are polls. These are just quick votings that we might do throughout the webinar. We can do an example one for you now just so you can see what it looks like. So the topic of this webinar is going to be on learning objectives. So just as a practice to have you experience a poll, how often do you write learning objectives for your classes? I include them in my lessons for every class that I teach. I don't always write them, but I think about them. I know that I should, but I often don't. Never. I don't see a value in them. Or what's a learning objective if you're not quite sure what a learning objective is. So you can click right on your screen for the one that applies to you personally on how often do you write learning objectives. Leave it open for a couple seconds longer. We've got about 65% of you voted. All right, we're at almost everyone now. So I'll leave it open for just another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And again, you just click right on your screen for whichever one and we'll get the vote. I'll show the numbers. So your experience with writing objectives, it looks like 68% of you include lesson objectives in your lesson plan every time you write one. 32% of you think about it but might not write it, and it looks like everyone at least sees value in it or knows what one is minimally, so that's good to see. All right, so those are polls. Again, there will be a couple polls throughout, and they will be just like that where you can click right on your screen. The next one is handouts. The slides for the presenter's talk are available in handouts. There is a tab in your control panel that says handouts. If you open that up, you will see a PDF that says Andy's webinar. You can download that, and it is the slides from the presenter. The download will no longer be available once the webinar has ended, so download them now so that once the webinar is ended, you can have it saved on your computer. If for whatever reason you're unable to download it, let us know and we can get them to you after the webinar. All right, and the final tool we have is a survey. At the very end of the webinar, a very quick survey will come up with only 3 questions, just so we can understand a little bit about who you are. We have a question to find out where you are, if you're watching this with anyone, and what you thought about the webinar. So it only takes a couple seconds, but it really helps us out in knowing a little bit more about you and what you thought about the webinar. So please, we ask you at the end to take the time to fill it out and send it to us. All right. So with that, we will begin with the webinar. Today's presenter is Rosa David. Rosie, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about?
Hi, my name is Rosie. I'm also an English language fellow in León, Guanajuato, Mexico. And I will be talking about how to write effective learning objectives.
Perfect.
So shall we get started?
Let's do it.
Okay, so the title of this webinar is Redefining How, oops, I'm not sharing it. Okay.
Did you get it now? There we go.
Let's get this going. Okay, the title of this webinar is Redefining How We Evaluate Our Students' Learning Outcomes. So today we're going to talk about how to write learning objectives. I want to make sure that you learn how to write learning objectives that are clear, specific, and measurable. Because as teachers, it's really important that we understand how we can assess our students because we want them to be successful in our English language classroom. So we're going to start with a poll because, you know, we like this to be interactive. Oops. So I want to make sure that we all understand what a learning objective actually is. So you will see that there is a series of 4 questions or 4 answers to this poll. The first one is a learning objective is a statement that defines what the student will be able to do at the end of the lesson, unit, and/or semester. B, a learning objective provides the criteria for evaluating the student's performance. C, a learning objective provides the conditions under which the student will perform a given task. And finally, D, all of the above. So please take a second and tell me what you think this is.
All right, about 30% of people have voted, so we'll leave it open for a little bit longer just to give people an opportunity to respond. All right, and we'll close it out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we'll share the results. Rosie, can you see the results?
Yes, I can see the results. So
okay.
The 2 results that I see that are very good is that they're able to define what students are able to do at the end of a lesson or a term or at the end of a year, or all of the above. So if you chose all of the above, you are correct. So let's just start with a general definition of what a learning objective is, just to make sure that we are all on the same page. So a learning objective is a statement that defines what students will be able to do when the instruction is completed. Now remember, instruction can be a day, it can be how you break things into units, months, semesters, and even over the course of years. So a learning objective has three major components. Number one, it's a description of what the students will actually be able to do. And we have to think about the conditions under which the students will be able to perform the given task or tasks that we want them to be able to do at the end of a class, a week, a semester, a term. And then finally, it's our criteria for evaluating our students' performance. So when you think about this, learning objectives are really, really important because we want to be able to assess how our students are learning in order to be able to move forward with our lesson plans and our own learning objectives for our students and the identified learning outcomes. So one of the easiest ways to do this is just to think about this simple term, students will be able to. So if I were you, I would make sure to jot this little term down because we will be using it for the rest of this webinar. And by using this term, students will be able to, we're able to put theory into practice and balance what we're teaching with what students need to know and what we need to know in order to assess them. So when you think of student success and how you can measure it, I want you to think about that term once again, students will be able to, plus the skills that we are teaching in all of our classes, listening, speaking, writing, and reading, and then what we are actually teaching, which I like to think of as the plan d'action or the class curriculum. And this is how we design an effective learning objective. So this is just the basis, and you will see this slide again in a few minutes. But I want you to think about this another way, because when we think about learning objectives, we don't always think of them in ways that are really practical and affect our day-to-day lives. So I'm going to read you a couple goals, and I want you to think about which goal is clearer. So you will raise your hand if you think number one, or person number one is clear, and later you will raise your hand if you think person number two is clear. So person number one is, or would say, when they're asked if or what their life will be like in 5 years, they would say something along the lines of, oh, you know, I'll be rich and famous, and I'll have my own private island, and my jet, and some jet skis, and, you know, life will be great. Do you think that's a realistic goal? Do you think that's clear, achievable? So raise your hand if you like number one. Okay, now let's look at
hands being raised.
Yeah, it's not achievable now, is it? Now let's look at person number two. Person number two is a little calmer, more logical, and thinks, you know, I will be able to finish a degree in computer engineering, and I hopefully will get a job with a software company. And then maybe that person will be able to buy, you know, a house and a car. Do you think this goal is more achievable, more clear, specific, measurable?
We have a poll, so I can open up the poll and people can vote on which one they like. So person number one about being rich and famous, or person number two about getting a degree and getting a job at a software company. So people can vote on which career goal is clear. Person one, rich and famous, or person two was, I believe, the degree and the job at a software company.
Yeah.
Oh, the votes have come in fast and strong.
Woohoo!
All right, we'll close it out in 3, 2, 1, and share them.
Oops.
93% of the people liked person two.
Okay, good. I mean, look, we all want to be rich and famous and own our own private islands. That's been my dream for years, but it doesn't seem achievable. But if you go to school, study, and work hard, there's a good chance if you're studying computer science and engineering that you will be able to get a job in a software company. Okay, so let's look at one more life goal. So again, which goal is clearer? How are you going to prepare for the TOEFL? Ooh, now I know lots of us hate the TOEFL, and when we think about the TOEFL, we get anxiety. We're like, another standardized exam. But there are ways to study for this exam, right? So person number one is casual about this. They're like, or no, is not casual about this, excuse me. Person number one is taking this serious. They're going to buy a TOEFL exam prep book and study 3 times a week for 3 hours for 2 months, and then they're going to take the exam. And person number two is like, nah, I'm going to take the TOEFL exam next month and move to a new country next January. So again, which goal is clearer? Did we do this one also in a
Yep,
poll?
we have another poll. So again, you have person one who's going to buy a book and study a certain amount of times each week, or person two who will eventually move to a different country, I believe. All right, they've come in fast again, so we'll just leave it
Yay.
open for a couple more seconds. People have very definitive answers on this. So we'll leave it open for another 3, 2, 1, and share the results. 90% of people liked person 1, 10% liked person 2.
So I like person one as well because person one has really set a roadmap to success. They've thought about how they need to prep for this exam. They're going to buy the textbook. They're going to study 3 times a week for 3 hours for 2 months, and then they're going to take the exam. While person number two is taking a really casual approach. And maybe number two will also achieve their goals, but we don't know that. But when we really think about learning objectives, we need a step-by-step process that gives us a way to measure our success. So learning objectives are a lot like our life goals. And in order for a learning objective to be achievable, it needs to be clear, specific, and measurable. We need to have steps so that we can see if we're achieving our goals as teachers, and we can see if our students are achieving their goals in their language studies. So again, we're gonna take a few minutes and look at a couple of learning objectives. And I want you to take another poll and let me know, or excuse me, I want you to raise your hand and let me know what you think. So this learning objective says, students will be able to practice new vocabulary about parts of the body. I want you to think, is this clear? Is this specific? Is this measurable? Now, if you do not think this is clear, you do not think this is specific, and you do not think this is measurable, I want you to raise your hand. Again, the learning objective is students will be able to practice new vocabulary about parts of the body. Is this clear? Is this specific? Is this measurable? If you do not think so, raise your hand. Let me go to my control panel. Oops.
30% of people so far have raised their hand.
30%. So maybe we need to look at another one. Should we wait a couple more seconds? What do you think?
It's pretty stable. I think we can leave it. It's about 35% now.
35%. So I want you to ask yourself why you think this is clear, specific, and measurable. We're going to move forward, but we will look at the same learning objective again. Okay, the next learning objective I want you to think about is this one. Students will be able to write paragraphs about what they did last weekend. Is this clear? Is this measurable? And is this specific? If you do not think this is clear, measurable, or specific, again, I want you to raise your hand. Students will be able to write paragraphs about what they did last weekend?
Not as many people are raising their hand for this one, Rosa.
Uh-oh.
We're at 16% now.
16%.
We're up to 20.
20. I want you to keep thinking about this. Is this clear? Is this measurable? Meaning that, can you tell if your students are achieving your goal for the class? Specific. What is in place? What is the focus of the class? How can we tell if our students are learning? How can we tell if we're doing a good job? Is this clear, measurable, or specific? How are those numbers?
There's some doubt. They went down. We're down to 17%.
Oh no. Well, once again, we will look at this learning objective in detail. Shall we move to the next one?
Yep.
Okay. And another learning objective. Students will be able to understand a dialogue between two people. Students will be able to understand a dialogue between two people. Do you think this is clear? Do you think this is specific? Do you think this is measurable? If you do not think this is clear or specific or measurable, I want you to raise your hand.
We're getting more hands this time. We're at 25%.
Woohoo!
27.
27. I like
31.
that number. 31. Okay. So again, students will be able to understand a dialogue between two people. Is this clear? Is this specific or measurable? Raise your hand if you do not think so. Still 27?
Oh, we're up into the 30s.
Yay! So from what I'm hearing, and what Maggie is seeing, is that the first two, or the first learning objective and this learning objective, do not seem that clear, do not seem that specific or measurable. Now, I want you to think about these learning objectives again, and maybe just write one short sentence about why these learning objectives would be hard to teach. So now I'm basically handing you the answer to those three hand-raising activities we just did. For me, as an English language teacher, they were not clear, they were not specific, and they were not measurable. Oops. So I want you to think about that for a second and just write a short sentence, maybe 1 or 2 words, to describe why. Why would these be hard to teach?
Write that right into the chat box. Veronica says it's too general.
Yes, it is too general.
Marco says there's no way to measure it adequately. It's not specific enough. Julio says there's no condition.
Yeah, all those are completely correct. We cannot measure them. Like if you just think about the dialogue between two people. Okay, what's the dialogue about? Why is it important? How long is the dialogue? All those little pieces matter when we're writing effective, clear, concise learning objectives. Are there any other comments?
Yeah. Flor de Maria says there's no way to measure them. Veronica says empty ideas. Again, it's too general. Victor Hugo says we need to teach the way, we need to learn better how to teach.
I do too. But no, they are empty ideas. So I will say this, it's a good skeleton, going back to the body parts, the first learning objective I showed you. It's a good skeleton, it's a good framework, but there's not enough information into it. When we write learning objectives, I want you to think about handing those learning objectives to another teacher, saying, I'm going on vacation for a week. You need to teach my class. This is what I want my students to be able to do when I come back. Here's the material you need. That's what a learning objective is for. It's for someone who may not understand what you're teaching, but it's also a way for you to assess how your students are learning. And so if you can't hand your learning objectives to someone else and, and they could actually walk in and teach your class, then we have a problem. So when we write learning objectives, we want them to be clear, specific, and measurable. And the ABC model for writing learning objectives, along with the 4 skills, listening, speaking, writing, and reading, and of course our activities that we put into the class, really help us think about how we should teach and how we can measure if students are learning. And this also gives us a structure or a scope and sequence in our lesson plans. So it really is the roadmap to successful teaching. So again, do you remember this slide? I'm sure you do. It's the students will be able to plus the 4 skills plus the curriculum. So you always want this framework. Now remember, these pieces can move around. So students will be able to, might be followed with the focus of the class, and then, or like the curriculum of the class, what you're teaching. Is it grammar? Is it listening? Is it speaking? Is it writing? Is it a couple of those components together? And then the actual focus. And these pieces can move around in order to create your learning objectives. So when you think about this, I always want you to start with the term students will be able to, and then build around this principle. Because with the phrase students will be able to, you can say, yes, students were able to, or no, they were not. It's a clear yes, no answer. And a really, really strong learning objective will have, or lesson plan, along with learning objectives, will have these pieces. So remember, for each class, you might write 2, 3 learning objectives, and they'll have these components. So you'll have listening, speaking, writing, and reading. And I always say that if you're teaching a class, you should at least try to incorporate 2 of these skills, if not all of them. Now I know in a lot of our teaching contexts, we're lucky if we get 45 minutes with our students. But even with 40 to 45 minutes, you can still focus on at least 2 of these skills, especially when you use your learning objectives as the foundation. And I also want you to think about who your learners are and how they learn. We all learn so differently. And when you look at this model, you see multiple intelligences. So our students learn many, many different ways. Some are audio. Others are kinesthetic. Some people like to study with other people, while others like to work alone. So we really have to think about pairing and grouping and how we put our students together and what kind of activities we're doing to facilitate learning in our classes. Now, unfortunately, I cannot spend all day talking to you about lesson planning, but what I can tell you is this: these pieces are important. And when you're writing your lesson plan and you're thinking about your learning objectives, I really want you to think about the learners. Now, as teachers, we tend to rely on the skill set that we have or how we're most comfortable learning. So for me, I'm a talker, as you can tell. So I'm intrapersonal, kinesthetic, and I really rely on linguistic information. But not all of my students are like that. So I always have to step back and think about other ways to teach so that I'm able to reach all of my learners. And my learning objectives reflect that. So here's another way to think about this. Really, input and output. Listening creates speaking. Reading can create writing. But remember, this can go all different ways. So these activities should move around. As a teacher, we should not just do teacher-fronted activities where the teacher stands in front of the class. We really need to try to move to student-centered learning, where students are active and participating in their own learning outcomes. So when we think about different types of activities, we need to think about incorporating listening, speaking, writing, and reading. And once again, going back to our learning objectives do just that. They build a framework as to how we can teach. This is another way to think about it. I like to think of this as the funnel, because when we look at our learning objectives, we have to think about sequencing. Now, one way to think about this is driving a car. We have to look in our mirrors to see what's behind us as we move forward. Some of you may be parents and may have children sitting in the back seat. You have to keep an eye on them as you're moving forward. This is very similar when you're thinking about writing learning objectives, because we have to think about classroom instruction and activities, and that goes into our funnel. We also have to think about how previous information connects with future information. So this can also be, or a good example of this is the to be verb. We know that we need to know how to use the to be verb in the present tense to be able to teach present progressive. We have to review some of these pieces, and we need to make sure our students really understand. So as we're moving forward, we need to think about our daily goals, our weekly goals, and our semester goals. And we need to think about building an interactive classroom and moving from guided to less guided instruction in order to see how our students are learning. And once again, concrete learning objectives help us with this. So, going back to my favorite phrase, students will be able to. What do I want my students to learn today? That's the micro level, today. What am I teaching them today? And how am I going to move forward with this? That goes to this week, this month, this semester, next year. And how am I going to assess that they learned this? And how do I go back to previous material to make sure that they're understanding? Because I have to be able to assess them every single day as I move forward. Because at the end of the day, I have to reach those curriculum goals. At the end of the semester, we're worried about our students obtaining all the necessary information to move forward. And really, a strong portfolio or lesson plans with strong learning objectives really allow us to go back in time and tell what we taught and if it worked. With this simple statement, students will be able to, we can say, yes, students were able to do this. No, students needed more work on this. And when we go to review, we know what areas our students are still having a hard time with. But this is a lot of information, and we know that just saying students will be able to is not enough. So let's start thinking about the tool or the ABC model in order to really support what I'm telling you here today. So the A.B.C.D model is a model for writing learning objectives. Now you're going to see all these pieces, and at first it's a little overwhelming, so bear with me. It will get easier. So the first thing you see is audience. Now remember, A, B, C, D stands for pieces that need to be included in an effective learning objective. So the first piece is audience. Who are the learners? Who are my students? What level are they? Do I have mixed level learners? What have they already learned? What will they be learning in the future? So really think of who are the students? Why are they here? What are we teaching them? And you can think of this on the micro level again as the individual, or you can think about this again as a whole class. Who is the audience? Who are my learners? B stands for behavior. So behavior, this one, when I first learned this, was a little tricky for me. But how will the
Rosie,
students
you're breaking up a little bit with the microphone.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Say it again? Yep, there we go.
Okay, sorry. So did everyone hear audience, do you think, Maggie? Or should I repeat that?
You might want to repeat it.
Okay. So we're going to start over with the A.B.C.D model for writing learning objectives. Now, A.B.C.D stands for these 4 pieces that help to write effective learning objectives. A stands for audience, which is simply put, who are the learners? So who is the audience? Who is the learner? Who are my participants? Now, think about their age, their level, what they're learning. If you have mixed level classes, this is a good way to start thinking about what students need what support in the classroom. B stands for behavior. B stands for behavior, which is how will the students be able to demonstrate what they're learning. So this is really where we start putting into play what we will be teaching and how we're measurable. I want you to think, when you think of behavior, what is the measurable behavior? Or what is the action verb behind what you want your students to be able to do? C stands for condition, or what is the circumstance or context that the learning will happen. So really think about at what we want them to be able to do at the end of class. And is this, or how have you separated your classes? Are they separated by the week? Are they separated into units within the semester? That's the condition. And finally, degree. How much will be accomplished and to what level? So at what level does the behavior need to be performed? So this is how we measure success. Do they need to have 100% accuracy? That's a little high. What level of accuracy are you asking for with the degree? Now I know audience, behavior, condition, and degree are really hard to wrap your brain around and to understand the first time around. So we're going to look at some learning objectives. So by following the A.B.C.D model, you can ensure that your learning objectives are clear, specific, and measurable. So I really want you to focus on audience, which is always students, okay? Behavior, which is what's measurable. Condition, how is learning happening? And degree, how we're going to measure it. So let's start with one of the learning objectives that we already saw today. Now, you don't have to type anything into your box if you don't want to, okay? But if you do, feel free to. So this learning objective said, students will be able to practice new vocabulary about parts of the body. Now, what was wrong about this? I know we had lots and lots of comments, but there are some things that make this hard. And I want you to think what's wrong with this in relation to audience, behavior, condition, and degree. I'm going to give you just a second to look at this, and then I'm going to tell you what I thought when I read this, okay? So I'm going to read it one more time. Students will be able to practice new vocabulary about parts of the body. Okay. First of all, the behavior is not specific enough because the verb practice is not measurable. We can't tell what we mean by practice. When we look at students will be able to practice new vocabulary about parts of the body, how are they practicing? We need to think about other ways to describe that word. So I don't know what this, so if I was to walk into this person's classroom, I would not know how to practice vocabulary about parts of the body. Is this oral? Is this written? How are we learning this vocabulary? And how are we practicing this vocabulary? The condition is missing, meaning we do not know how the students will practice this. Okay, so you can see how practice and condition go hand in hand, or they go together. We, again, really don't know how to achieve this goal. And the degree is missing. We don't know how we would measure this. So how can we know if students are learning? How can we manage our expectations for our students and their learning outcomes? So I took a minute and I rewrote this learning objective for you. So let's look at it. Students will be able to identify parts of the body by naming at least 10 body parts in a speaking activity with a partner. Now this, for me, is clearer. But again, since I'm not very familiar with the A.B.C.D model, I think we need to break it down again. So let's look at it. The audience is always the students. Your learners are always the audience. So A is done. We understand who A is, or audience. Behavior. We'll be able to identify parts of the body by naming. Okay, I'm starting to understand what behavior is. It's the description of what the students will be able to do. And notice the verb choice here, identify. It becomes clearer in comparison to what we saw before with the word practice. By identify, we know that they have to be able to place what the body parts are. Ah, and here's the condition in red. In a speaking activity with a partner. So that's really important because now I know how the practice is happening. It's in pairs. And finally, the degree. So they need to be able to identify at least 10 parts correctly in order to meet my assessment tools. So I hope this first learning objective helps you. Remember, in blue you see audience. The students are always your audience. And in green you see behavior because it's what the students will be able to do at the end of the activity, which is identify parts of the body by naming. And then degree again, at least 10 body parts, and the condition in a speaking activity. Okay, so here comes another ineffective learning objective, or a learning objective that needs just to be changed just a little bit to make it clearer, to make it more specific, and to make it measurable. So let me read it to you. Students will be able to write paragraphs about what they did last weekend. What's wrong with this? I'll give you a second to think about it, and then I'll tell you what I thought when I read this learning objective. Okay. Well, the first thing I thought was, again, the condition is not specific enough. Condition referring to under what circumstance should the learner be able to perform. So again, how are the students going to achieve this? I don't know what they're even trying to achieve. When are they doing their writing? Are they doing it in class? Are they doing it at home? What other requirements are there? Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I could teach this. 2, the degree is missing. So again, the objective is not measurable. How much do they need to write? How accurate do they need to be? And what are they writing about? I know they're writing about last weekend, but what past tense are they using? It's hard to see. So let's rewrite this learning objective. This one looks a little clearer. Students will be able to write 2 4 to 5 sentence paragraphs in 20 minutes during class about what they did last weekend using the simple past with 90% accuracy. So if I was to walk into this class, take the lesson plan, and read this learning objective, I feel confident that I could teach this and say to the teacher at the end of the week, at the end of their vacation, yes or no, their students were able to do this. So we need to break this into pieces again because we need to know who the audience is, the behavior, the condition, and the degree. So again, the students are the audience. This is the easiest part with the phrase students will be able to. Now, we see the behavior. Students will be able to write 2 4 to 5 sentence paragraphs. So now we know what the actual objective is in the behavior, how we can measure it. You see the verb to write? Think about what that means. It means they actually are writing. They're not practicing, their writing. It's clear what we're expecting them to do. The condition in 20 minutes during class about what they did last weekend using the simple past. So now we know that the students have 20 minutes in class to write about what they did last weekend, and I know what the grammar focus is. It's the past, the simple past. Now, you could also combine tenses here, right, to make this a little bit more difficult, but you know what you want your students to be able to do. And finally, we have the degree, which is we want them to be able to do this with 90% accuracy. But the part that's really important here is when we're talking about accuracy, we're actually talking about the simple past. So when we're grading this activity, we're going back to making sure that students are able to use the simple past. Now, you could say irregular verbs or something along those lines to change this, and you can change your accuracy. But I feel that 85 to 90% is good. Okay, so we're looking at another learning objective that just needs a little work to make it more clear, or to make it clearer, specific, and measurable. So let's look at this one again. Students will be able to listen to a dialogue between two people. Oof, this one's tough for me. I don't know what the students are trying to do at all. So when we look at this, what's wrong with this learning objective? Well, first, the behavior is not specific enough because the verb to listen is not measurable. So we need more information packed into the verb, listen. We need more information to be able to tell what this listening activity is trying to do. The condition is not specific enough. What is the dialogue about? Why is this listening activity important? How does it meet my curriculum goals? How does it meet my learning objectives? The degree is missing. We need a way to assess how we will be able to understand how well our students are obtaining the target material. So again, we need to rewrite this learning objective. Oops. So here's what I was thinking. Students will be able to correctly answer at least 8 out of 10 multiple choice comprehension questions after listening to a dialogue in a restaurant. Now, this learning objective is a little bit more complicated than the ones we've seen before because of the placement of the pieces, but that's okay because we can still see that audience, behavior, condition, and degree are all there. So again, the audience is always, always, always the students. And what do we want them to be able to do? Behavior. Well, we want them to be able to correctly answer multiple choice comprehension questions. But you see, at least 8 out of 10, well, that's going to be the degree. But before we get to the degree, we need to understand that we want this to happen after listening to a dialogue that occurred in the restaurant. And the degree is we want them to be able to answer at least 8 out of 10 questions. So I hope that the A.B.C.D model is becoming clearer to you. So I want to give you a little comprehension check. So my question to you is, which components of the A.B.C.D model are missing from this learning objective? And the learning objective is students will be able to practice new vocabulary about the classroom. Is it condition and degree, audience and behavior, behavior and condition, or degree and audience? Now remember, audience is students, behavior is the measurable behavior or the action verb. Condition is under what circumstances should the learner be able to perform this task, and degree is how we measure their success.
Okay, we'll open up the poll. So you can vote on your screen again on which of the options you think is missing from the learning objective. Answers are coming in, but slowly, Rosie. You're challenging them on this one.
I know, and it's a lot of information.
All right, we're almost at 50% of people, so we'll leave it open for just a couple more seconds and we'll close it out. All right, last opportunity to vote. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll put up the results. There you go. You can see it, Rosie?
Woohoo! Yeah, I can see it. Well, I am very pleased because it is a condition and degree. So I see that most of you are beginning to understand the A.B.C.D model. Now remember, this is a 40-minute webinar and this is a lot of information. So what this really needs is practice. Sit down, write your learning objectives this way for a week or two and see if you like it, because really it helps you decide how to navigate your teaching. Oops. So I just want to say a couple more things before I let you ask me questions. And with the A.B.C.D objectives or the ABC model, you want to make sure that you are able to observe your students' learning and that you're able to measure the outcomes, that they're clear and easy to understand and they're not ambiguous, that the results are oriented with specific learner outcomes. So really, when you think about what you're teaching, you can really tell, yes, they achieved it, or no, they did not. They did pretty well, but I need to repeat this part of the information. And then we really are trying to communicate a successful path to learning. Think about the action verbs, the action verbs that you use. So the more specific of a verb you use, the easier it is for you to measure it. And this is written in terms of performance. So when you're writing learning objectives this way, you want to be able to answer the yes/no question. Yes, they were able to. No, they were not. And I just have one more slide for you. What's most important about learning objectives is when you're writing a learning objective, you want to be able to determine what your students know at the end of the lesson. So really this yes/no question, students will be able to, yes or no, because that way you know what you have to repeat. That way you know what was hard for them, and that way you know how to direct your own teaching. Because at the end of the day as teachers, we do not get enough feedback from our students about their learning, especially when we're working with young learners. So it's always nice to know when you've had a successful class interaction. And the best way to do that is through your learning objectives. That's how you get to pat yourself on the back. So when your learning objectives are clear, measurable, and specific, you're really able to tell if they're learning. And learning objectives, I argue, build a sequence into what you're teaching. So I hope that this webinar has been useful, and I'll take any questions you have.
Yeah, we have a couple questions that came in throughout the webinar. The first one was from Cecilia, and she wanted to know if the lesson objectives can be used for all age groups or if it's just for specific ages.
Yes, I think you can use them for all ages. I've taught ESL in the United States where I had mixed levels. It was a community ESL class, and I literally I used this model to write learning objectives for different levels within my class. So I think that, as long as you think critically about the learning objectives and how you want to measure them, you can write them for all levels. Yes.
All right, and Graciela had a question on if the learning objective can help the student to be clear about what the lesson plan is. So would you recommend sharing the lesson objective with the students?
That's a great question. I think they need to be rewritten a little bit. I don't think saying students will be able to, so at the end of this lesson. But you could say, my goal for this class is, and then explain to them explicitly. I think that also goes back to what is your teaching philosophy. For me, I always try to be clear about at the beginning of class, and then at the end of class about what we are covering, what we are learning, and what the focus of the class is, so that students know what they're learning. So yes, learning objectives can be used that way, but I do think they need to be rewritten to meet the students' needs, which doesn't take much time at all.
And Ceci had a question. Well, she more is commenting on when you talked about multiple intelligences
Mm-hmm.
and with taking that into consideration, how that makes assessment a little more difficult. So if you have any suggestions on how to assess with multiple intelligences in mind.
Well, I love multiple intelligences, and then I also really love thinking about learners with different needs and teaching from multiple perspectives, so teaching different learning styles. And I think that listening, we're really lucky with being language teachers that we get to teach listening, speaking, writing, and reading because those four skills really combined audio, kinesthetic. They really verbal learners. They really change how our classrooms work. So one way to think about multiple intelligences.
Rosie? Hello? All right, well, it looks like we lost Rosie. Okay. Well, sorry to come to an abrupt end, but it is 4 o'clock anyways, so I guess that's
I'm
our
here.
cue.
I'm back.
Oh, there you are. You're here?
Woohoo! I got scared. Yeah, so is everyone still there? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so when you think about multiple intelligences, really think about the four skills, listening, speaking, writing, and reading, and how those four skills support multiple intelligences and where those would fit. So for kinesthetic learners, how can you combine kinesthetic learning, so the need to move and the need to interact, with speaking and listening and writing and reading activities? So I really think it actually supports um, our learning objectives. I hope that answers the question.
hmm Yeah, and Julio also commented in addition with learning objectives that Bloom's taxonomy also
Yeah, so
complements this very well. See.
I was going to go into blooms, and I debated that really for quite a while yesterday, and I decided that um, it was a little too much information, but actually the A.B.C.D model fits perfectly, and there's a lot of information on the web about how these two models work well together. So yeah, that's a wonderful comment. Thank you.
And there's been a couple comments too asking where people can go to find more information, if you have any suggestions on sources or websites where people can go to find more information about the topic.
Um, so you can just Google ABCD model and Bloom's taxonomy, obviously. I don't. I could actually email you a couple little handouts, but they're not mine. That's why I did not include them. And they're not geared specifically to English language education. They're just for general education. But if I sent those to you, would you be able to get those out, or would that cause a stir?
Uh, mm, we
Probably hard.
can post it. We can post it on the Relo Andy's Facebook page is what we can do.
Okay, perfect. I'll send a couple things. But literally, Google. If you Google ABCD model, it will come up, or writing learning outcomes with the ABCD model. You'll get lots of information on this. There's literally pages and pages on this,
All right,
but it's mostly for general ed.
perfect. All right, well, thank you so much, Rosie. Got
Thank
a
you.
lot of thank yous from people. Very interesting
Yay.
webinar. All right, we will have another webinar. Again, just as a reminder, the material is available on the handouts tab. You can download it now. If it doesn't download in time, you can contact us. We'll put our contact up information. But before we do, I just want to let you know about our next webinar. That is going to be in January. The presenter will be Roger. He's joining us from Trujillo, Peru, and he's going to talk about ideas for how to use authentic materials in the classroom. That will be on Wednesday, January 18th at 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock. So we hope you can join us for that. We'll get registration emails coming out after the new year. If you are looking for more information on how to connect with us, if you want to learn about future webinars or get the information, you can email us at reloandes@state.gov. You can also respond to me directly in the confirmation email that you got when you registered for the webinar. And either through that email or through the Relo Andes one, we can get you the material if you missed it, or if you have any comments or questions, we're also happy to receive those. Like we said, you can find us on Facebook, and when Rosie sends us material, we can post them that way. You can either get them through email or we can post them on the Relo Andes link. We are also on Twitter, and all of our webinars are recorded and they are put onto the YouTube channel. So if you go onto YouTube and just look up Relo Andes webinars, you will find us there. So we hope to see you next week, or next month, I mean. So happy holidays and enjoy the new year. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you in January. Thank you, everyone.